Thank you.
Ms. Chair, we'll now be hearing from Anna Pincus.
Thank you, Ms. Livingston.
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly,
declare and affirm
that
the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thanks, Ms. Pincus. Take a seat. You provided a large first statement to the inquiry on the 10th of November 21, which I think you have in front of you. For the transcript reference, that's DPG 000002. And I'd ask for that to be adduced in full, please. And Ms. Pincus, you also provided a shorter second statement, which I think was dated the 18th of November 2021, and that's references DPG 505. And I'd ask for that to be adduced in full as well. And Ms. Pincus, what that means is that the whole statement will be available on the inquiry's website, so it means I don't need to ask you about every paragraph. I'll just be taking you to some paragraphs and then asking you questions about them, okay?
Thank you.
Okay. So firstly, looking at your role, you're currently the director of the Gdwg Detainees Welfare Group, that's right?
That's correct, yes.
And I'm going to shorten it to Gdwg, which I understand lots of people do anyway, so hopefully I don't trip up over it too much. And during the relevant period, which in this inquiry is April to August 2017, you were at Gdwg, but you were the Senior Advocacy Coordinator and Outreach Manager, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And you initially started in 2005 as a volunteer visitor at Gdwg and then became employed a year later, is that right?
That's right, yes.
Okay. And in your statement at paragraph 4, you set out some training which you've received whilst you were at the Gdwg, including on things like developing supportive relationships, understanding suicidal language, working with those suffering PTSD. When you were being trained on that, was that with other NGOs? Was that with anyone else working at Brookhouse?
Those were external training sessions that I attended individually.
Okay.
I was requested to by my organisation.
Okay. And did you find that type of training helpful?
Incredibly helpful, yes. Always helpful just to take time away from the workplace to give extra consideration to things. And you can see from the range of things that in a small NGO, everyone does a bit of everything. So although some of these things weren't central to everything that I did, it was just important to be broadening my my learning.
And on things like working with those suffering from PTSD, do you think you'd have been able to do the work that you did at Gdwg without that training?
Because at Gdwg we aren't trained counsellors and we're not therapists, we're responding to people on a human level with our instinct. I think I could have been effective at supporting people, even manifesting those quite serious mental health problems. But where it was particularly useful for me, that particular course, was so that I could recognise if this was someone that I should be referring to an expert, so that they could give a more detailed support and encouragement. So.
Okay, and as part of that training, were you trained? Trying to think back to 2017, can you remember? Had you received training on drug awareness at that time?
I think we did a training within our charity.
Okay.
With the involvement of Anton Bolle.
Okay, and have you? We're obviously focusing on 2017, and much of the questions are going to be about that. But we also want to understand a little bit about the current situation and current practice.
Yeah.
Have you received any more sort of significant training since that 2017?
I have been on a safeguarding training. We do safeguarding training annually.
Okay.
And I've recently been on an equalities for recruitment training. As I say, because we're a small charity and we're doing a little of everything, it's quite important to keep updated in lots of different areas.
Yeah. I'm going to move on to ask you a bit about Gdwg and the role that the organisation played in 2017.
Mm-hmm.
You've set that out in some detail in your witness statement, so instead of getting you to repeat it all, I'm going to summarise it, and you can tell me if you think that's about right. So you set out paragraphs 7 to 13 of your statement, a summary of what Gdwg does, saying that it provides a wide range of emotional and practical support to detained people held at Gatwick IRCs, and that this includes offering friendship and practical support, advocating for fair treatment, and calling for positive change and a future without detention. You also say that you try to use your own insight as an organisation to try and improve conditions for people held in detention, inform policy, and challenge negative images of people affected by immigration. Is that solely looking at Brookhouse and Tinsley House, or is that more widely?
The knowledge that we have is from our work in the centre over 25 years. So we're in a privileged position of having kind of unique access to all those stories, all those data. We have to honour it and use it in the best possible way that we can to effect change. So, yes, it's largely a focus on the information that we get from there, but people who are detained at Brookhouse and Tinsley House get moved around the detention estate. And after detention, they also suffer the effects of detention. So we reflect on how detention impacts their lives after detention and upon their entire journey around the detention estate.
And have you ever found in your work for Gdwg that the aims of improving conditions, so within detention centres, and offering support for people within detention centres, and your aim of calling for a future without detention, have you ever found that those conflict or collide, or do you find that you're able to pursue them all?
They're also closely related. So our work as visitors, as a visitors group and a welfare group, the heart of that is conversations in the visits room. And we've been having those conversations for 25 years. There comes a point where you have to recognise the harm that you see being done to people and to express that and to work for positive change. So, people ask us if we're a campaigning group. If you think of the word campaign as a signifier for marching or petitions, we aren't doing those things, but we are using the stories of people who've been detained. In our project called Refugee Tales, we share those stories, and then we use the stories written down to have conversations with people of influence. But those aren't kind of binary, shouting, Twitter arguments. It's very much trying to connect people with the visceral power of story to make them realise how a general policy impacts at human level. Okay. So I think we're best placed to explain how policy impacts individuals. Okay. That has to be an important thing.
So it's connecting the systemic issues with the individual people who experience those issues. Okay.
Yeah.
You refer, just looking at sort of how Gdwg is structured, you obviously talk about your network of volunteer visitors. I'm not going to ask you much about that because we heard from Mr. McPherson yesterday, who is a volunteer visitor. You also refer to a small team of advocacy coordinators, staff who coordinate the work of volunteers and provide support and advocacy themselves. This is the team that you led during the relevant period, yes?
Yes.
And you set out in your statement at paragraphs 10 to 11 what the team does and did, including matching volunteers with detained people, referring detained people to external agencies, and helping detained people navigate the detention system, and also providing sort of material support, whether that's clothing or phone cards and things like that.
Yeah.
Is that a fair summary of what your team did?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
And one of the things you mention in your statement at paragraph 11 is that part of the role was to raise concerns with Brookhouse management where there were concerns about a detained person. Is that something that all advocacy coordinators were told was part of their role?
It was part of their role, yes.
Okay. And you also mention about helping detained people to use complaints processes that exist, including contacting other organisations such as the IMB. I'm keen to get a sense of whether this was proactive or reactive. So what I mean is, would you be telling them that, you know, if you ever need to make a complaint, this is how you do it? Or would it be that if someone told you something or had a complaint, that you would then say, well, this might be how you want to do it?
So it would be reactive.
Okay.
If someone told us that there was something that they were very upset about, something that had happened recently, we would explain to them the ways that they could make a complaint.
Okay.
And sometimes they would ask for our help. Sometimes they would just need us to talk through to give them the confidence to do it for themselves. But I'd have to say that most people that we met did not feel safe enough to make a complaint.
Okay. We'll come on to the sort of issues about that a bit in due course. In your statement, you talk at paragraph 23 about how detained people come to you as an organisation. When I say you, I don't always just mean you personally.
Yeah.
And you describe a mixture of self-referrals from posters and leaflets, some word of mouth between detained people,
Yeah.
some referrals from the welfare office, some from chaplaincy, and some from elsewhere.
Yeah, Samaritans.
Were you aware whether detained people were told about your organisation upon induction into Brookhouse?
Oh, that's a really interesting question, because that was something we really wished for. We wished that we could have our flyer. We've got a flyer that says, "Would you like a visitor?" And we really hoped that would be in the induction pack. And at that time, I think, we weren't able to achieve it.
And do you know whether people were told about it without getting a flyer, or do you not know?
Well, although we weren't given permission to have the flyers in the induction pack, we understood that flyers were in the centre. At least we used to take them in. We could never, of course, check for ourselves whether they were displayed. But we used to take them in to be in the library for people to hopefully see and pick up.
And were you ever told by a detained person or by someone else about whether detained people were encouraged or discouraged or neither by Brookhouse staff to contact you?
I think we were certain that the welfare staff were encouraging people to contact us, because they would actually telephone us from welfare and say, "I've got a man here, he needs phone credit, or he's about to be removed, can you give him removal money?" And hand the phone to the person to speak to us.
And was that Mr. Syred from the welfare office, or would it be a mixture
It may
of
have
people?
been.
Okay.
I can't remember who it was at that time.
Okay. Now, at paragraphs 26 to 27 of your statement, you talk about the sort of process once somebody came into contact with you as an organisation, and you say there would be an initial phone call with the detained person to take preliminary information, and then make a connection, hopefully over the phone, and then there would be a visit by a member of staff. Just on that phone call, would that be done using the phone that the detained people were given when they were admitted? Do you know?
Yes, I think it would.
Be. And in terms of that visit by the staff member, would there always be a member of staff who would see the detained person in person first before a visitor saw them?
That was our intention. There were very rare occasions when, for some reason, we were short-staffed, when we'd have to just allocate someone a visitor on the back of a phone call. But in general, we felt it was best to see somebody before we allocated a visitor.
And would you, because we've heard evidence that obviously detention in Brookhouse was indefinite in the sense that there wasn't a time limit on
Yeah.
it, but would you know when you first came into contact with a detained person how long they were likely to be in there? Would you know if you only had 48 hours to see them, or if you had a week to see them, or a month?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, detained people had no idea how long they'd be detained. Detained people had no idea why they were detained. People would come and see us and say, I don't know why I'm here, please find out, please explain to me what's going on. They had no clue what was happening to them, for many people.
Okay. And that first in-person meeting that you say you tried to have, how long would that last typically, or is there no typical time?
So those first meetings were timetabled for half an hour, so that we could see 4 people in the course of the 2-hour period that we had the room for.
Okay. And I think I'm right, and we're going to come on to talk about this, that these were called drop-in sessions, even though I think you say in your statement that they weren't technically drop-in sessions because somebody couldn't actually just drop in, they already needed to have an appointment. Is that right?
Yes, exactly.
We'll refer to them as drop-ins because that seems to be the language that was used, but
Yeah.
it's noted that they weren't actually drop-ins. And you've said that those usually took place in private rooms, which were the same as those used for legal visits. Was that always the case, that they would take place in private rooms?
Yes, they were always in private rooms. Sometimes if all the legal visit rooms were full, we'd use the rooms that were used for the video link bail hearings. Okay. But always private rooms.
You never had to do those first meetings in the visits hall?
No, only at the period in years before that, when once G4S suspended our drop-ins.
Okay. Do you, when was that roughly?
I think it was roughly 2013.
Okay, we won't. That's obviously a few years before the relevant period, so we won't go into that. You've said that it was far preferable to see a detained person in a private room rather than the visits hall.
Yes.
It may seem obvious to you, but can you explain why that was far preferable?
People were much more likely to be open about how upset they were feeling. When our visitors see people in the visits room, there are lots of other detained people with their families. And sometimes there's a bit of kind of macho bravado. You don't want to appear vulnerable in front of other detained persons. So people would definitely put on a bit of a front in the visits hall that would not be evident in the room when we met them one-on-one.
And you say in your statement at paragraph 30 that in order to get to these initial visits in the legal rooms, detained people had to go through a security search and then be given access through barred gates and then often wait for a period of time. Would you, as an organisation, have preferred to see people within the main communal areas of the IRC so that they didn't have to go through that?
Yeah, it would be absolutely, it would be so different if the drop-in was a real drop-in, in the sense that passing people could see us seated at a desk and just sit down and talk, because the current structure of drop-ins and the structure then, and the need for people to self-refer meant that people who didn't speak English, who were illiterate, and people who lacked confidence, people who were unable to communicate because of issues of capacity, all those people we weren't able to reach, and would be much more likely to reach them if we could just see them walking past, make eye contact, be welcoming, and encourage them to sit down and talk to us. And
you know in your statement that after that initial visit, staff would maintain contact and would often speak regularly on the phone with the detained person. Can you give any sort of estimate about how often staff would speak on the phone with someone, or is it just totally varied?
It's totally varied. So someone might see us, it might be quite a transactional relationship. They might just need a phone card to be able to tell their family where they are. Someone might be in the centre, not have a pair of shoes, being sent back to a country and only have the flip-flops they're walking in. They might only contact us once. Somebody might take a while to warm up with us, to feel that they trusted us. And then it might be irregular contact at first and then more frequent contact. So these were not linear relationships. People might contact us irregularly and then get bad news from the Home Office or have a problem at home, or just start to feel escalating feelings of despair and need more support.
Okay, and we'll come on to talk a little bit more about how there were restrictions on the number of times that you could see, as staff, the number of times you could see someone for a drop-in.
Yeah.
Am I right in thinking that there was no restriction on the number of times you could speak to them on the phone?
There was no restriction other than the difficulties of reaching people on the phone because of poor connectivity.
And I wanted to ask about that. It's obviously quite a practical question,
Yeah.
but I mean, did you find that generally you were able to get through to people if you wanted to speak to them or they wanted to speak to you, or were there just sort of areas where there was no signal?
Quite often there was no signal. It was immensely frustrating, and not just for us, for people's families, for their legal representatives. It was just another thing that they had to battle with.
And what about text messages? Were you able to text with people?
So that would be quite an informal level of communication that as a charity we wouldn't really use. We only ever use text to send somebody the numbers for a phone card, to be sure that they were getting the number for the phone card securely.
Okay, so you wouldn't be chatting?
We wouldn't be chatting or messaging, no.
Okay. Coming on to the numbers of people that you saw, you set this out at paragraph 32, which is on page 13 of your statement, and you've given some numbers for the number of detained people you assisted across Brookhouse and Tinsley, so the combined numbers, they are, that you say, 1,376 people in 2016, 1,071 people in 2017, and then almost double that in each of the next 3 years. So what that suggests is that there was quite significantly fewer people that you were able to assist in 2017 than in other years. And I think you say, trying to look at Brookhouse individually and the relevant period individually, that you assisted in some way a total of about 380 people. So that, according to my maths anyway, is about 76 people a month. Based on the figures that you've given overall and that figure of 76 a month, do you think that was quite low, that 76 a month during the relevant period?
It was a very interesting exercise writing this statement and seeing those figures, because at the time I had no sense that they were lower. We certainly weren't less busy. And I've reflected on it since because I was asked by the inquiry for the reasons why, and I tried to work those out. But since then I've wondered whether it might also have been the severity of the situation of the people, of the kind of level of desperation at that time, that we were actually having to put a lot of time in to certain individuals. Maybe why it wasn't experienced as a lower, we weren't less busy, we weren't twiddling our thumbs.
And just to get an idea of how we get to those numbers, because obviously you've just said that you weren't less busy. Is it possible, even if you can't remember exactly, that there would have been other detained people who had sought assistance from Gdwg that you weren't able to assist because of capacity issues? Or would that be everyone who came to you who were able to help in some way?
That would have been everyone who came to us.
Okay. And yeah, you've given in your statement some of the possible reasons. You've just obviously given another one there for the lower numbers in 2017. One of the reasons that you've given was that Brookhouse were restricting the number of times that you could see detained people. Now we're going to come on to that in more detail later, but presumably that wouldn't affect the number of people you could help as a whole. That just affects the number of times you could see them. Yeah.
Yes.
You also say that you had increased capacity from 2018, that a member of the chaplaincy team who had been referring people back in 2016 had left by 2017. Also from 2018, you started to hold drop-ins at Tinsley House as well. And then also you say that you were told in February 2017 by Anton Bole of the Forward Trust that he hadn't seen your posters or leaflets in Brookhouse other than some in French and Spanish, which you say may mean that detained people didn't know about GDWG. Trying to think back to 2017, did you think at the time that there was any sort of deliberate attempt to sort of suppress people's knowledge of GDWG, or do you think it was just that leaflets were not getting passed out properly?
I'd have to be honest and say, it could be that somebody tore down the leaflets or other leaflets got put up over our leaflets. I couldn't be certain about the intention.
Okay. I want to come on to that issue about restrictions on repeat visits and your relationship with G4S and the Home Office.
Yeah.
Now, we'll also be talking tomorrow with this about this with James Wilson, who was the director of GDWG at the time. But a quick background for the chair and for the public is that I think I'm right in saying that in 2016 and 2017, Brookhouse management generally restricted the number of drop-in sessions to one per detained person unless there were exceptional circumstances. Is that right?
That's correct.
And so where you or one of your staff met a detained person in the legal visits room, as we've already discussed, unless there was an exceptional reason, you weren't generally allowed to then have a second visit with that same person.
That's correct.
Okay. And you say in your statement at paragraph 37 that you understood that the reason given by Brookhouse management for seeking to limit those drop-in sessions to one per person was that they thought the role of GDWG was or should be limited to a befriender service only. I'm asked on behalf of G4S to ask you on what basis you understood that they thought you should be a befriender service only.
Because members of G4S stated that to James in meetings.
Okay.
And James will be able to give you the exact details of those meetings and exactly what was said.
Do you remember whether you were ever told that, or were you hearing from James the position?
When
Wilson?
James was told that, well, actually it was before James, when the previous director was told that, he wouldn't sign a memorandum of understanding on that basis.
Okay.
That continued into the time of James. James informed me that we couldn't do a second drop-in.
Unless there were exceptional circumstances.
Unless there were exceptional circumstances, and we had permission from management. I think I've said in my statement once, I was in a meeting and a DCO interrupted my meeting and told me that this was the second time I'd seen the person I was seeing. It was not. I would not have seen someone a second time, as I wasn't permitted to.
Yeah, you do refer to that. That's at paragraph 42 of your statement. You say it was DCO Gayatri Mehra who burst into the room saying that this was a second visit and must end now, even though in fact it was a first visit.
Yeah.
Do you remember, did that occur during the relevant period from April to August 2017?
It did, yes.
And do you have any insight as to why she had that attitude towards you as an organisation?
I have no idea why she was feeling it was necessary to kind of police that rule. She must have been informed by management that that was the rule, because she wasn't herself a manager, I don't believe.
Okay. And we'll go into, as I said, tomorrow with James Wilson, how this sort of restriction on drop-ins evolved. But you say at paragraph 39 of your statement that your sense was that the restriction in drop-in sessions to one per person was done to try and limit GDWG's work for detained people, to reduce, not encourage, safeguarding concerns from being raised, and that this was because that they considered that your work interfered with the Home Office's purpose of removing people. You also refer, Ms Pincus, to a quote from Dan Houghton, who I believe was a manager at G4S at Brookhouse during the relevant period. For the record, Chair, that's at ver 000290, but we don't need to bring it up because it's within Ms Pincus's statement. And you extract that quote in which he says, they started seeing, and they as GDWG, started seeing the same detainee several times in a month. They'd see the same person 3 times, and you think, hold on, surely you've seen that person once. You've said, you're the perfect person for this volunteer. We'll get you to see them in a social capacity. That's where the casework was coming into it. And I think that they, GDWG, were starting to interfere with the Home Office in terms of the Home Office's objective of removing people from the UK. GAC Welfare Group were then starting, I think, to cause issues in that. Do you accept that you were interfering with the Home Office in terms of their objective of removing people from the UK?
No, we were not.
And in terms of Mr. Houghton, Dan Houghton, was he a sort of liaison between you and G4S, or did it just so happen that there was correspondence between you and him? Do you remember?
So I had no contact with management at that time, I'm afraid.
Okay.
That would be a question for James.
And what do you say about him commenting on his perception that you were interfering with the Home Office's objectives? Do you have any views on that?
I just find it unfathomable because we're a welfare group. The reason we needed to see people more than once was, as I've said, because relationship with people aren't linear. If we needed to see someone 3 times, it was because that person needed more support. Very often, we were assisting Brookhouse by explaining to people why they were being held, by helping them to understand whether they had a legal representative when they'd been to a legal advice surgery and come away with no piece of paper saying who they'd seen, whether they were represented. They just had no clue about what was going on. So.
And do you think that this is the sort of the thrust of it, which you've just said there, which is you felt that you were helping them to be able to run Brookhouse, and did you see that as a sort of opposing viewpoint, that you saw yourselves as helping them because you were helping detained people understand things, whereas they saw you as perhaps an impediment?
I can't say what their perception was, but we were not an impediment, and very often our visitors diffused different situations that could have escalated and caused problems for Brookhouse just by calming people down, making them feel heard, making kind of human interventions that meant that moments of crisis didn't occur.
And you say at the end of paragraph 39 that G4S saw us doing too much and they wanted to restrict what we were doing for detained people. Do you maintain that position?
Yes.
And I know I'm asking you often to comment on their reasons for things, so I know you can only say what your perception is, but do you have any insight as to why they wanted to restrict you, what you were doing for detained people?
It's unfathomable. I don't know why they wanted to restrict what we were doing for detained people.
You also come on in your statement at paragraphs 40 to 41 to discuss an occasion when a staff member at GDWG asked Dan Houghton to see a vulnerable detained person for the second time, so for a repeat visit. And you set out in your statement that this was refused by Mr. Houghton on the basis that your drop-ins had, and I quote, developed into a welfare surgery. Do you accept that your drop-ins had developed into a welfare surgery?
Well, welfare is a word that means looking after the well-being of a person, and the well-being of a person depends upon them having information and understanding what's happening to them.
So I suppose, is the answer, yes, you do accept that, but you don't see a problem with that you were providing welfare support?
We were providing welfare support, yes.
And you say in your statement that and this is at paragraph 41, that the consequences of Mr. Houghton refusing that second drop-in were potentially very serious. Why do you say that? Do you remember? Why do you say the consequences were potentially very serious?
Because a person who was possibly under 18, who was allegedly under 18, was asking to see us because they had something to tell us. They did not want to tell us on the phone. It could have been, it could have been any manner of things, but it could have been a safeguarding issue. We tried not to ask Brookhouse for second appointments unless it was really necessary, because our relationship with them was rocky. We thought that was a definite example when they would have to say yes, because it was someone who was potentially underage and it was a potential safeguarding disclosure, and they said no. And
in Mr. Houghton's response, which is set out in your statement at paragraph 40, but is also for the record at Gdwg 503, page 27, Mr. Houghton says, as explanation, he says, the detainee, I'll read it out. He says, to put it bluntly, no. There has been scrutiny from outside and concerns raised about your drop-ins. It has developed into a welfare surgery. This is not its intended purpose. From the Home Office's point of view, this is not the purpose of your drop-in. The detainee has been integrated into the general population and is doing well. We have built this support plan with him, and he likes it. And just looking at those last two sentences, the suggestion that the detainee had been integrated, doing well, and he likes his support plan. What did you take that to mean, or what do you take that to mean?
I think it was dismissive because it denied the detained person the choice to identify somebody in the centre they felt comfortable talking to make a potential disclosure. So a detained person might not go to officers in the centre as a first port of call to talk about something delicate, or even possibly about the way they were being treated in the centre.
And
so,
sorry, carry on.
Yeah, I think that person should have had the opportunity to share with us. All it was a second drop-in.
And again, trying to look at it now, do you have any view on the reason why G4S refused that request?
I think the tone of the email, I know it's hard to gauge a tone of an email, but it felt dismissive. It felt as if we were being kept at arm's length or excluded from developing supportive relationships with people in detention.
You refer, when talking about repeat visits in general, at paragraph 43 of your statement, you suggest that detained people, in your experience, need time to build up trust and rapport and tend to convey information in stages. In your experience, both personally and sort of organisationally, what impact would repeat visits make on a detained person's ability to disclose things?
I think they're crucial. I think they're crucial. You have to remember that we were in the drop-in corridor. It's the same corridor where embassies come and do interviews, where Home Office interviews sometimes take place, where legal visits take place. So it would be easy in that context for people not to understand the first time they come and see us that we're an independent charity. The room itself kind of belied the nature of our interaction. I think I say in my statement, on one side of the table, there's a chair with a padded seat that I sit in. On the other side, there's a chair with a plastic seat that the detained person sits in. There's a power imbalance. So to make a connection in spite of that environment, in spite of the architecture, took some doing. And people would often come in to the first meeting, almost challenging you not to connect, not making eye contact, being brusque. And you'd have to work really hard to develop trust. It's not always easy to do that in half an hour, especially with a language barrier.
And were you ever told directly from a detained person who you perhaps either spoke to on the phone again or had another visit with, that first visit, that they'd not felt comfortable or not felt able to disclose or anything like that?
Many times, yeah. People would reflect back, I didn't trust you the first time I met you. They'd sort of say, look how far we've come in our understanding of each other.
And in your ideal world in which you're visiting people as an organisation, obviously you assign people volunteer visitors if that's what they want. If you could have it, I suppose, as you wished, would you just wish there to be no restriction on the amount of times that you could see people if they request it? Is that what you would like?
I would, yes.
And I suppose what did you see as the difference between someone's ability to disclose something to you or another member of staff at Gdwg and their ability to disclose something to a volunteer visitor? Because obviously visitors are allowed to see people as many times as they want, I believe. So why couldn't anything that they need to disclose just be disclosed to a visitor?
Some people would make disclosures to visitors, but very often, not very often, sometimes most vulnerable people actually didn't have a visitor. They didn't feel confident enough. They weren't well enough. It takes quite a lot of confidence to build a relationship with a stranger in a visits hall. And for people who were that unwell, staff in the office would maintain communication. And there were certain people who were so unwell that we would telephone them every day just to check in, make sure they were safe, see how they were doing.
And you say in your statement that where you had an exceptional need for it during the relevant period, you would ask G4S, for a repeat visit.
Yeah.
But you tried not to do it unless it was really exceptional.
Yes.
Do you have any sense of what sort of proportion of requests that you were making were being granted during that time? Because obviously we've got examples of where those requests were turned down, but presumably there were occasions where they were accepted as well?
There were, yes. And I can't say how many, but I know we weren't making many requests.
Okay.
Because I'm sure you'll come to this tomorrow, but James was threatened by management to cease our drop-ins if we overstepped certain boundaries.
And I know,
and that was something we were terrified of happening.
And I know that it's difficult to give a number, but are we talking sort of that you would request a repeat drop-in once a month, once a week, or do you have any insight, which one of those?
To the best of my memory,
Yeah.
It would have been twice a month.
Okay, that's helpful. And were you've already said that you felt, or to your understanding, James was threatened with stopping the drop-ins, and I'll obviously speak with James, but we'll speak with James about that tomorrow. You personally and you as an organisation, did you feel deterred from making requests for drop-ins, for second drop-ins during the relevant period?
Yes, we did.
Okay. Now, you've said obviously that your requests were often queried or denied or granted only on an exceptional basis, and you've spoken about a draft memorandum of understanding. If we can bring that up on screen, please, at Gdwg 503 page 1, please. Sorry, it's GDW 3, page 1. Sorry, I confused it by saying 5. Thank you. And if we can zoom in on the first few bullet points, please. Ms. Pings, you've seen this document before, yes?
Yes.
So this was a draft memorandum of understanding between G4S and GDWG. It's dated February 2016. You referred to it as an unsigned memorandum of understanding. We can see that it's not signed. Was it your understanding that during the relevant period that this wasn't agreed, and so this was just a sort of working document, or did you understand this to set out the agreed position?
It was my understanding that it was unsigned.
And you'll see, obviously, at bullet points 2 and 3 that it talks about surgery sessions, which I think is another word for visits or drop-ins. Yes.
Yes.
Yes. And then the second bullet point says the purpose of the meetings is to allow for GDWG staff to conduct an initial interview with detainees in order to assess the individual needs of detainees and identify an appropriate GDWG visitor to attend for ongoing visits. Do you accept that that does describe the purpose of the meetings?
I do, but I think it also doesn't recognise the dynamic nature of assessment. You don't see somebody once and assess them and then they maintain the same level of vulnerability for their entire time in a detention centre.
And the third bullet point says, on occasion it may be in the interest of a detainee to have a further follow-up meeting in private with GDWG staff. These will be exceptional circumstances requiring prior agreement with G4S and Home Office management. Did you understand that to have been the agreed position during the relevant period?
Yes.
Okay. And it says there that it required prior agreement with G4S and Home Office management. Did you understand that you needed to get both of their agreement or just G4S's agreement?
At that time, we would only email a member of G4S management.
Okay.
I don't know if they would also forward the request to the Home Office.
And just while I remember, because it occurs to me, when talking about repeat visits, if somebody was detained at Brookhouse, then transferred to the Verne, for example, and then went back to Brookhouse, would that still count as a repeat visit if you saw them during their first time of detention and their second time of detention?
I don't think it would.
Okay.
No.
If we can stay on that document but go a bit further down to the penultimate paragraph, please. We're going to come on to a bit about safeguarding and referrals and things later, but just while we're on this, you'll see that it says, as part of the GDWG surgery meetings with detainees, it is critical that where any GDWG staff member has reasonable cause to believe that a detainee may be suffering or may be at risk of suffering significant harm, a member of Brookhouse IRC staff is notified immediately. Did you follow that paragraph?
We did. In fact, I can remember one meeting when I was in a drop-in when I was extremely concerned about the man I was seeing, and I actually refused to leave the room at the end until one of the members of staff had called Oscar 1.
Do you remember whether that was during the relevant period?
It may not have been during the relevant period, sorry.
No, it's obviously difficult to date things.
Yeah. Yes, that's our policy.
And maybe suffering or maybe at risk of suffering significant harm is obviously language that often tends to be used in safeguarding policies and things like that. What did you take that to mean?
I would take that as at an imminent risk.
And what sort of risk could that be?
If someone told us that, you have to understand that most people in Brookhouse would tell us that they felt generally hopeless, and that they were suffering with anxiety and had low mood. So that would be for most people that we met. But if somebody was talking about committing suicide, had a plan, was displaying any of the manifestations that we'd been trained to recognise, then we would make an immediate disclosure to the centre.
And what about...
And our volunteers would do the same.
Oh, okay. And what about if somebody said that they were scared of their roommate or somebody else who was on their wing or somebody else in the centre? Would that fall within that, to your view?
It would, yes.
Okay. And what about if they said they were scared of a member of staff?
Yes.
Okay. We'll come back to sort of referrals and stuff later. Just coming back to the visits issue. You say in your statement that the rule on repeat visits, as in that you can't have them unless there's exceptional circumstances, hasn't been formally lifted, and you have over time become used to trying to avoid repeat visits wherever possible. Obviously, Brookhouse is now run by Circle. Is that still the position now, that you wouldn't do a repeat visit without permission?
We haven't raised it as an issue, but we do repeat visits now.
Without needing to seek permission?
Yes.
Okay. And, okay. Now I want to come on more broadly to the relationship between Gdwg and various of the people that worked at Brookhouse or with Brookhouse. You've said in your statement that you had a very good, and that's at paragraph 156 for the transcriber, that you had a very good collaborative working relationship with welfare officers at Brookhouse. Can you expand a bit on that?
I think welfare officers were extremely overworked. They always seemed to have a queue of people, or they would describe to us, they had queues of people waiting to see them. So it was in their best interest to maintain a good relationship with us, because we were able to assist them in many different ways. So not just in allocating a visitor so that somebody was less dependent solely on the support of the welfare office, but also it's extremely time-consuming reuniting people with their property. And sometimes we would go to police stations and collect it for people, and we would take that off their shoulders.
So you were essentially able to collaborate because you were able to do some of the work that they didn't have the resources.
Yes.
To. Okay. Now you describe also your relationship with Frontline detention staff. How would you describe that relationship with the Dcos and Dcms at Brookhouse?
I think there are some DCOs. Well, first of all, I should say most of our contact was with DCOs.
Okay.
Because we didn't have access to the wings, we weren't in the main body of the centre. The only time we met, ACOs.
Okay.
Most of our contact was with ACOs. We only came into contact with DCOs when we were on the corridor, on the visits corridor. It was really important for our charity that we built the best relationship that we could with them. We had no gripe with them. We wanted to be able to help people in detention. Having a good relationship with them was by far the easiest way for us to do that. When we took on new visitors, we'd say, when you're going into the centre, if it's particularly slow or you see something that is trying your patience, please don't express that. Remain courteous and patient at all times. Come back and report any concerns to the office and we'll raise the issues.
Okay. And you do say in your statement at paragraph 157, you say, however, the treatment of detained people by frontline staff, some of which you've described in your statement, impacted on GDWG's working relationship with them. Mm-hmm. In what way did it impact on it?
So just give you an example. People would make an appointment to come and see us at a drop-in. Sometimes that person might then be moved to E-Wing or CSU. It might be quite poorly in E-Wing and need an officer to physically bring them to the drop-in corridor. If we had a good relationship with Brookhouse officers, we could have said, oh, we've got this person down, they're on E-Wing now, could someone bring them up, please? And that would have worked fine. But it was usually like, they're in E-Wing, they can't see you.
Okay.
So
you were sometimes told that you couldn't see someone because they were too vulnerable?
Yeah.
Okay. And you do say in your statement that there were some positive reports about staff, mm-hmm. but that this wasn't the norm. Was this generally positive reports about individual members of staff, or was it about staff as a whole?
Individual members.
And turning to the relationship with G4S and Home Office management, mm-hmm. You say that the relationship was generally poor. In your mind, was it equally poor with G4S and with the Home Office, or was there a significant difference in your relationship with either of them?
Every time, so again, this is a question for James, but every time he had a meeting with G4S, the Home Office were also present, and they were displaying the same views and behaviours.
Now, in your statement at paragraphs 163 to 164, you echo James Wilson's view that the behaviour of managers towards GDWG, the criticisms and the attempt to restrict the number of our visits and the type of work we do had an impact on how we've advocated for detained persons. In what way did it have that impact in your experience?
Sorry, just let me read the paragraphs.
Yeah, of course.
So this relates to the issue of complaints. And if a person in detention was apprehensive of raising a complaint themselves, they might ask us if we could raise it for them. This is not the threshold of a safeguarding issue.
Right.
And in this case, because there was a kind of culture of fear at the time, the Home Office and G4S were very effective at silencing GDWG with the threat of removing our drop-ins.
Do you think that they were trying to silence GDWG?
I believe so, yes. Because of that, those kind of routine complaints, and I'm not talking about ones on the threshold of a safeguarding issue.
So just to give some examples, sorry. Routine complaints, might we be talking about, whether they've got toothpaste or clothing or sort of conditions in their cell or room? Would it be that type of thing?
General conditions. We would say to people, please, speak to your legal representative. They may be able to raise those issues with the centre more effectively than us.
And you say in your statement that you felt forced to advise people to go via their legal representatives because you, as an organisation, were fearful of antagonising those at Brookhouse in case they punished you for speaking up by restricting your access to clients. Was that something that you felt during the relevant period?
Yes, it was.
Okay. Now, you've been asked to comment in your statement at paragraph 166 on some minutes which refer to comments from G4S in the Home Office, that they had reservations about some less appropriate actions from GDWG. And that's quoted in your statement at paragraph 166 for the transcriber. It's at IMB 000003, pages 2 to 4. Now you come on to say at paragraph 167 of your statement what you think was meant by that. And you say that you think it refers to some Twitter posts by a staff member back in 2013, and also the fact that one of your staff members, Naomi Blackwell, gave a witness statement as part of a detained person's judicial review. Is that right?
Yes.
And I'll be able to ask Mr. Wilson more about this tomorrow, but were you yourself aware of a negative reaction towards GDWG as a result of Miss Blackwell providing that statement?
This is a question for James, but I do believe that he had a meeting with G4S and the Home Office where they were particularly aggressive about the fact that she had done that.
And do you know, from your personal experience, whether since then GDWG staff have provided witness statements in support of litigation brought by any detainees about detention other than the one that James Wilson provided in 2018?
I believe we have, but only very rarely in extraordinary circumstances. It's not something we regularly do.
And have you ever communicated to staff, or has it ever been communicated to you, that you shouldn't do this because it might antagonise the Home Office or G4S?
Not recently, no.
Okay. You say in your statement, talking about this issues, that there are obvious concerns about trying to stymie such evidence. It might be obvious, but if you can help, what are the concerns that you see about trying to prevent GDWG staff giving evidence in support of detained people?
I think very often we are literally the only people in a position to see what's happening to an extremely vulnerable person, or maybe somebody lacking capacity isn't going to be reaching out, advocating for themselves, making external contacts beyond the four walls of the detention centre. In those circumstances, we're the only people who can bear witness. So if we can't write a statement saying, this is what we see, then no one will ever know what's happening to that person. They're literally invisible.
Now, hypothetically, during the relevant period, 2017, if you had been asked to provide a statement in support of someone who you'd visited, do you think that you would have done so, or do you think that you would have not done so?
I would have had to ask the director. He may have had to consult with the trustees. It wouldn't have been something I would have felt I had licence to do.
Okay. You also give another example in your statement of what you think they meant by less appropriate actions, such as a volunteer visitor who provided surety as part of a bail application. Don't need to go into that in detail, but you say overall at paragraph 169 of your statement, you say, it felt to me that G4S's continued reference to these incidents was a way of exerting control and justifying the position they wished to take, which was to curtail our activities and therefore any criticism of them, or worst of all, reduce the number of removals. This attitude and approach prevented a more positive working relationship and meant that Brookhouse managers could not learn from the information we could provide to them. Do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's very clear. Sorry.
No, carry on.
When you consider at that time the number of visitors we had, the number of visits they were doing, the number of relationships they were developing.
And when you say the number, do you mean that there was lots?
There were lots.
Right.
Yeah, sometimes you go in the visits room, every single visitor would be a GDWG visitor. Think of all of that work we were doing, and it was beautiful work. You know, it was connecting with people in the most difficult times, making transformational relationships in a context that was pretty brutal. It was bringing humanity to a very, very difficult situation. Now, that's something to be celebrated not to find the 1 or 2 misdemeanours that we may have committed 4 years ago to give us a reason for denying us better connection with them. It was really hard to understand.
And I know you said it's hard to understand, but I'm asked on behalf of Duncan Lewis and their clients about whether you have any view on why G4S took this approach to you.
There was you've heard other witnesses saying there was a culture in the centre that was not positive, and I think this is a manifestation of that culture.
Okay, I'm going to come on to that now, because you refer in your statement at paragraph 171 to a comment that you made to the interviewers from Verita, the Lampard inquiry, that Brookhouse management was a closed culture. If we can bring up on screen, please, VER 000249 at page 15. Chair, that's at your tab 11, sorry.
Thank you.
Is there a problem getting it up? Okay, well, I can ask you about it. It was VER 000249. But if you don't have it, I can ask about the contents anyway, because you've extracted them in your statement, I think. Okay. And we can come back to it if necessary later. But this is where you said, Ms. Pincus, that Brookhouse management was a closed culture. I'm just going to check the exact wording so that I'm not misleading anyone. Oh, perfect. And if we could zoom in on paragraphs 177 and 179, please, towards the top third. Thank you. So you say, and you've been talked about, you said at the top, actually, before that, a closed culture, and then you say you don't like focusing on individuals, and then you say the whole thing is the broken culture, and you say that reflects the culture of disbelief of the Home Office. So first of all, looking at the sort of closed culture, the broken culture, what did you mean by that?
I meant that the institution was not a listening one, and therefore it was not a learning one. May I give an example from my witness statement?
Please do.
So in the witness statement, there's an example of an email that I sent to management asking whether they would consider moving someone from Brookhouse to Tinsley House. Tinsley House is a much more humane environment than Brookhouse. And this was a man who was in crisis. His partner was about to give birth. I felt that if he were to be moved to a different environment that wasn't re-traumatising because he'd been imprisoned in his own country, he might cope with the coming few weeks.
We can actually bring that up on screen as well, if possible. It's Gdwg 00003 at page 33. And Chair, that's at your tab 15.
Thank you.
Now, the previous page shows that this was an email on the 7th of August 2017 from you to Dan Houghton. If we can go back to page 33, please. And it says, hello Dan, I met a detainee that I was concerned about last week, and in view of the symptoms of stress he's manifesting, I wonder whether you could consider moving him to Tinsley House, where the environment might give him fewer triggers for post-traumatic stress from his time of imprisonment. Obviously, you know the case much better than I, but I would appreciate any consideration you can give the request, particularly at a time when his stress is likely to escalate with his partner being about to have a baby without him there. With many thanks and all good wishes. Is that the email you were talking about?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, Chair, I was trying to be as polite as I possibly could and make a request. And the response that came back, maybe you could...
Yeah, the response, I think, is on the previous page. Sorry. Yeah, so there was a response or an email that was sent from Steve Skett to James Wilson about this email. Is that what you're referring to? Or is there a specific response to you?
Yes, that's the one.
Yeah, so it says, James, please see below and your staff contacting the IMB.
No, that's a different...
That's a separate one, isn't it? Let me find the response. 1 second.
No, sorry, I must be remembering a different disclosure. When James was told that my email had been inappropriate because I was assuming clinical knowledge about post-traumatic stress that was inappropriate for me as a GDWG
I think you say in your statement actually that this email from you was discussed during a meeting in the 18th of August, and that Steve Skett complained that your email was an example of a concern raised to the right person but in the wrong way because it was not for you to diagnose a risk of PTSD or to request a move. Is that right?
That's right. So, I mean, first of all, I had actually attended a training on PTSD, which you mentioned at the beginning. But second of all, if I was expressing something inappropriately, that was not the point. The point was his concern should have been directed at how well the detained person was, and to focus on the tone of my email rather than the issue of the well-being of the detained person seemed to me illustrates that it was a broken culture.
And you've referred to broken culture, closed culture, and you've also referred to a culture of disbelief within the Home Office. What do you mean by that?
So people felt, or when we met people in detention, they would say that when they spoke to people in the Home Office and when they spoke to people in G4S, people didn't believe what they said.
Okay. And you say in your statement that at the time, so you first of all talk about this email that you sent in August, and then you say that at the time, many detained people had problems which you wanted to raise with Brookhouse management, but which James Wilson thought it unwise to raise for fear of antagonising the Home Office. So was this case sort of one of many similar ones, but this is one of the only ones that you actually emailed the G4S about?
This was such a delicate, or such a reasonable request that James, in his judgment, he thought they could not possibly object to it. So he let me send the email.
And just to check, was there a sort of filter? So you've met with someone, you have a concern, and you check with James whether you should email or whether he should email or whether someone should email. You wouldn't just go ahead and email yourself?
At that time, we would check with the director, because he wished to oversee our relationship with G4S because it felt so rocky.
Now, more broadly, talking about this broken culture, a closed culture, a culture of disbelief, you say in your statement at paragraph 176 that if Brookhouse managers had adopted a relationship which involved openness and a willingness to listen, that you'd have been able to provide valuable insights that would have been beneficial both to detained people and in the running of the centre. In what way do you think that it would have benefited the running of the centre?
I think we, not just because staff were meeting people in a drop-in, but because our visitors were seeing people weekly, they could gauge the mood of the centre. They could tell when people were frustrated by different sequences of events.
And you think that if you'd been able to have communicated that would have helped G4S and or the Home Office to sort of know what was going on?
Yeah.
I want to come on to a separate topic now about complaints. In your statement, and sorry I'm jumping around a bit in your statement, but at paragraph 83, you say that when detained people mentioned that there had been mistreatment, they'd usually say that they didn't want a complaint to be made. What reasons would they give you if they gave you reasons for not wanting to make a complaint?
So the most important thing to someone in detention is what's going to happen to them in the future, how long they're going to be detained, whether they'll be returned to their family, whether they'll be returned to another country where maybe they fear for their safety. The people who make the decisions about that are the Home Office. People learn from a young age to be acquiescent to the people making decisions about their future. It would be like a child challenging a teacher. The stakes were so high for people, they would tolerate a great deal before they would wish to bring something to the attention of the Home Office and risk putting their head above the parapet and any reprisals. And I'm not saying there would be reprisals, but that was a very real fear that people had.
And was that something that people actually expressed to you, that they, something had happened, but they didn't want to make a complaint because they were worried about their immigration case or what might happen to them?
Yes.
And if someone, or when someone said that, did you see it as your role to try and sort of reassure them, or how would you respond to that?
We would explain the different ways that they could make a complaint. So they could make an anonymous complaint. I think there was a box, like a letterbox in the centre. They could post a message in there. If they couldn't write or their English wasn't very good, they could speak it to us. We could actually write it down for them and give them a piece of paper for them to put in the box. So we would explore the options for people as best we could.
And you come on to say in your statement this is still at paragraph 83, that if the disclosure raised a safeguarding concern, we would request the detained person's consent to inform Brookhouse's Safer Community team. If consent was refused, but we continued to believe that there was a safeguarding risk about which we were required to breach confidentiality, we would raise this with the Safer Community team. So what constituted safeguarding concern or safeguarding risk? Is that the sort of thing that we were talking about earlier about significant risk of harm?
Yes.
Okay. And so in that circumstance, you'd ask if they were okay with you raising it, but even if they weren't, you had a duty, as you saw it, to pass that on.
We did, and also our visitors were trained to have those conversations,
Okay.
to say to someone, I am your befriender, but you have told me something that, affects your safety. You've made this disclosure to me. I now have to inform someone in the centre.
And we'll come on to some specific examples in due course, but when you're looking at safeguarding concern, and we've talked about this sort of significant risk of harm, presumably you're looking very much at the risk to them at the moment and potentially any risk in the future, rather than what might have happened in the past. Is that fair?
It is fair.
And so is it right to say that if somebody told you that something bad had happened to them 3 months before, but that they were fine now and they were content, or they didn't see themselves at any risk anymore, would you still see that as the same type of safeguarding concern, or would that be different because you didn't, as you might see it, at risk at the time?
I think it's not black and white, so it would depend on the circumstances. Obviously, all of these calls need kind of fine and sensitive judgments. and we would take advice where necessary.
Is that legal advice, or is that...
West Sussex Adult Social Care.
Okay,
We
from
can
the
call them
safeguarding.
about safeguarding issues.
Okay. And where, you say that where a detained person wished to raise a complaint, you would explain their options, and you would offer to help to write the complaint, and potentially make the complaint yourselves if necessary. Is that right?
Yes.
But you say that your preferred approach was to encourage or assist them to share their concerns with their legal representatives. Is that right?
At that time.
But as you say at paragraph 88, many detained people had no legal representatives in your experience. Is that right?
Yes. I think about a third of people didn't.
And so in those circumstances, you might be more likely to offer to do it yourselves, rather than because they didn't have someone else to do the complaint for them. Is that right?
Yes, although obviously we weren't acting as legal representatives.
And so we've obviously discussed this. This is the general approach for what GDWG would do in relation to a complaint.
Mm-hmm.
Was this process ever written out somewhere? Was there ever a policy which said, if you hear this, you have to do this, or anything like that?
There is a safeguarding policy, and there was one at that time,
At the
yes.
relevant time. Okay. And was that communicated to staff and volunteers?
Yes.
Okay. Chair, I think that might be an appropriate moment to have a break, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Maybe returning at, my maths is gone, but 25 to? 22?
So is mine. 11:40.
Yeah, that's
11:40.
perfect.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
See you then.
Ms. Pincus, before the break, we were talking a little bit about the safeguarding policy and the approach that you would take to complaints or disclosing safeguarding concerns. Jamie McPherson said in evidence yesterday that visitors were encouraged to report issues raised by detained persons with them to central office. Would that have been to your team?
Yeah, so we are one office.
Yeah. Does central office just mean the organisation?
Yeah,
basically?
6 members of staff, yeah.
Okay. And is there a sort of central email address, or would it just be that whoever he knows that's in the team, he might just email one of you?
So when we met somebody for the first time in a drop-in, whichever member of staff met that person and made the connection would then connect them with the visitor and become the point of contact for that
So
person.
there's sort of a liaison staff member for each.
So they would
person.
either contact the person who was concerned with the person they were visiting, or if they identified it as a safeguarding issue, they might have gone straight to the director at that time, who was a safeguarding lead.
So you have a safeguarding lead within your organisation. That was James Wilson at the time, is that
Yes.
right? Okay. And at the
Now
moment
it's me.
it's you. Okay.
Yeah.
And Jamie McPherson also said that central office would investigate if they deemed it appropriate to do so, but that you would have to pick and choose which complaints you'd raise with G4S, because otherwise, he said, you'd be constantly complaining. What do you say about that? Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, probably every single person that we met, for example, would complain about the food. So we wouldn't be complaining to G4S every time we had a complaint about the food.
And just to get an idea of the sort
But
of... Okay, so carry on.
if someone was a diabetic and they needed a particular diet, and we thought, their health was suffering as a result, then we might raise the issue with the centre. But
And-
that would probably be with healthcare.
And just to get an idea of the sort of filtering process, I guess, presumably, as far as you understand, the same person chats to a visitor, and then the visitor won't report everything that the person said to central office, but presumably you would expect the visitor to sort of filter out some things and only report some things, some concerns to you. Is that right?
If a visitor had a matter of concern, they would give us a call. We were very approachable. We made sure they knew that better to be in touch with us over something that was trivial than to hold that worry to themselves.
And during the relevant period, I think you've said that you would you would check with James Wilson before you went to G4S to raise a complaint. Does that apply to things raised by visitors as well?
Yes.
And then so it would be essentially James Wilson's decision at that time whether something went to G4S or whether you sort of just kept it.
That's correct.
Okay. I understand this is a Rule 10 from G4S saying that they understand that there's now a form to be filled in for safeguarding concerns. Does such a form, well, first of all, is that right? Do you have a form now that you fill in if there's a safeguarding concern?
Do you mean a form within our organisation?
Well, or a sort of G4S form that you're meant to fill in? Is there any sort
I'm
of
not
form?
aware of any G4S forms now.
Okay. Or Serco forms.
Serco, sorry.
Yeah.
If I raise a safeguarding issue with Serco, I write safeguarding issue in the heading of the email.
Okay. So it's still done by email. There's no.
It's still done
specific
by
form.
email. We as an organisation have safeguarding forms.
Okay.
And those can be raised by a member of staff or a visitor or a trustee.
And did you have them at the relevant period as well?
I don't think we did.
Okay,
no.
that's a newer thing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Do you know, and I suspect, well, do you know how many safeguarding concerns were raised by GDWG or volunteers with G4S during the relevant period?
I'm sorry, I don't.
And did you as an organisation have any monitoring processes in place to ensure that safeguarding procedures were being followed by staff or volunteers, so anything to check that a visitor is correctly passing things on. Was there any way that you had of monitoring that?
So we had training for our visitors, and it's hard to remember in the relevant period. I can tell you what we do now, if that's helpful.
Yep, that's helpful as well.
Yeah. So we have a safeguarding strategy. That includes that all staff have to attend safeguarding training once a year. Safeguarding is on the agenda of every staff meeting, every trustee meeting, and every local visitor group meeting. Those local group meetings are every 6 weeks, where visitors come together for peer support with a member of staff.
But is there any way of checking that a visitor is passing on serious concerns?
Once we allocate a detained person to a visitor, that doesn't mean that then the office absents ourselves from having a connection with the detained person. So we maintain that connection. We ask them how visits are going. We're not checking up on our visitors, but just to make sure everything's okay.
And so you'd sort of hope that something
So
would come
they
up
would
there.
be able to tell us,
Okay.
yes.
Okay. One of the things you refer to in relation to complaints in your statement, and this is at paragraph 86 for the transcriber, is that you refer to detained persons being unwilling to make complaints about other detained people by whom they were being targeted. What, if anything, do you think could be done to improve the sort of willingness to make complaints about other detained people?
I think the only way that could happen is if there was an atmosphere of trust. So if people knew that if they spoke to an officer, it would be in confidence. If they knew that a resulting action would be proportionate, I think it would be probably not a very helpful answer.
No, it's that's your answer, so that's helpful.
Yeah.
You gave at paragraph 87 some of the reasons why people were reluctant to make complaints in your experience, and they'll all be considered. And in summary, those were including that people would sometimes be too unwell or vulnerable to make complaints. Some of them viewed complaining as pointless, or they were dissuaded by detention staff. What do you mean by dissuaded by detention staff?
Detention staff would tell them not to make the complaint or withdraw the complaint.
Explicitly?
Explicitly.
And were they ever given a reason or told why they should withdraw a complaint or not make a complaint, to your knowledge?
I think they were trying to prevent a greater accountability, but I don't know, I can't remember the detail of the conversations.
And are there any staff members that you were specifically told had been dissuading people from making complaints or telling people to withdraw complaints?
Not by name. This is one of the problems, that I don't think detained people were always aware of the name of the person that was addressing them. So I don't think people wore visible name labels. I think they had the names on kind of lanyards that could flip backwards and forwards or be under a jumper, or so they wouldn't always know the name of the person who they'd had an encounter with.
And do you recall, is that specific issue, so about staff telling people not to make complaints or dissuading people from making complaints, was that something that you or your organisation ever raised with G4S or the Home Office?
We didn't, because very often when people made complaints, and when they make complaints now, they're ruled to be unsubstantiated. So if it's the word of a detained person against an officer whose name they don't know, it's very difficult to take that complaint further.
And just so that we have an idea of the sort of scale of this specific issue about dissuading or telling people to withdraw or suggesting that people withdraw. Can you give us any indication for how many times you were told that? Ideally during the relevant period, but if not, sort of at least a sort of sketch of how many times. Is it a very frequent thing? Is it very rare?
It's hard to say because I'd find it so shocking that it would stick in my mind. So it would probably be more prominent in my mind than actually the number of times would belie. So it may only have been one a month.
Okay, but still one a month.
To us,
okay,
like one instance of that would be shocking.
But you think one a month is that a fair estimate? And we're not going to hold you to this.
At that time, yes.
Okay. And is that something that still is an issue now, that people say they're being dissuaded from making complaints or told to withdraw complaints?
I think it happened rarely outside the relevant period.
But now, looking at the position now.
Now it's hard for me personally to say because I'm not doing the drop-ins.
Okay.
So I'd have to ask my colleagues.
Okay. Now I want to come on to the issue of physical mistreatment of detained persons. I think you've already answered this, but generally, where staff or within your organisation or volunteers within your organisation told that they should ask detained people whether they'd been mistreated, or were they just trained to listen and if there was a report, react to that?
We didn't have a checklist of questions to ask people. We weren't mimicking the Home Office. We were a welfare group. Our conversations were led by the people that we were visiting.
Okay, so there's no standard question of, are you suffering any mistreatment?
No.
And we've spoken a bit about the sort of process if there was a safeguarding concern. Now, an allegation of mistreatment, starting with physical mistreatment, presumably that might be a safeguarding concern, or it might not. Is that right?
I think it would relate to the safety of a person.
Okay.
Yeah. So
you've already told us about what the process was if you had a significant risk, if you thought someone was at significant risk. Being quite specific, if someone said to you a month ago they were assaulted by a staff member, would you consider that to be a safeguarding concern?
I think I would, yes.
And in your statement at paragraph 58, and again, I'm sorry for jumping around, but it's at page 23, you say that you're aware of 5 detained people who told Gdwg they'd been physically mistreated by staff during the relevant period, a further 3 who alleged mistreatment by escort staff, and then some others who have alleged mistreatment outside of the relevant period. You've provided anonymised summaries of these reports at Gdw 000010, if we could bring that up on screen, please. Chair, I'd ask for this to be adjusted in full, please.
Thank you.
Ms. Pincus, I appreciate that you don't have the permission of detained people to provide any more details of these incidents than is set out, so I'm not going to ask you in any more detail about what happened to them, but I do want to understand a bit more about the response of Gdwg and how those allegations came about. But I'm right in saying that on some of the occasions within this table, staff or volunteers at Gdwg were told about mistreatment at the time. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm going to go through a few of the examples. So example 1, we can see that it refers to a detained person telling your organisation that he'd been sworn at, punched in the chest, and pushed to the ground by a member of staff. And you say that you sent a complaint to the Home Office, the IMB, and you referred him to a solicitor. Were you making those complaints on his behalf, or was that a sort of safeguarding referral, or both? Do you remember?
Well, a safeguarding referral would be on his behalf.
Okay, but safeguarding referral would presumably be to G4S, telling them that somebody's at risk of harm, whereas this refers to a complaint. So is that different?
Oh, I see what you mean. Did we flag it up as a complaint or as a safeguarding
exactly.
issue?
So it's a complaint to the Home Office or IMB or from a solicitor might be, this thing happened to me and I want redress, I want it to be investigated. Whereas presumably, and this is what I've been trying to perhaps clumsily get out, there's a bit of a difference between that and a safeguarding concern, which is you saying, G4S, safer community team or management, this person's at risk. And so what I want to understand is whether you know whether in this case there was a safeguarding referral made or whether it was just a complaint.
So this is a complaint because he's not saying that the officers pose a continued threat.
Okay. Understood. And do you know whether the complaint that was sent to the Home Office and IMB led to any investigation?
I don't know that, sorry, I'd have to look at our records.
Okay. And as far as you know, because it's not written here, there was no safeguarding referral or form completed in this occasion?
It doesn't appear so from the summary.
Okay. If we can go to example 4, please. This refers to a detained person who you say appeared as very vulnerable, complained of mistreatment, and then if we go over to the next page, please, where that's continued, it notes that a few days later, in a phone call, he told Gdwg that he'd been hit on the left side of his head by a staff member. He was not fully coherent and did not provide clear information. You spoke with him again. You say it appeared during that call that he was self-harming. Spoke with him again and presented with delusions and paranoia. You understand that his solicitor raised concerns, but there was no response within a week. And then you sent a further email, and then 6 days later, you received an update that he'd been transferred to another IRC following an altercation between him and detention officers. Looking specifically at the allegation that he'd been hit on the left-hand side of his head by a staff member, do you know if that specific allegation was ever reported by Gdwg to G4S?
It was, and in fact I was looking at this before today, and if you notice further down in the report it said, sent another email to the Safer Community team, and that's called the Safer Community or the Safer Custody team, that's the reporting email for safeguarding. When I look back on the record, in our haste to summarise this, we'd missed that we made an earlier, there was an earlier email to the Safer Community team after the first phone call, which is why it says another email further down.
And so you think...
we reported that.
The being hit on the left-hand side of his head. And do you know if that was ever investigated?
I don't know that, no.
Do you remember, or are you aware of whether the name of a staff member was given? I know you've said that often they weren't, but do you know whether it was in this case?
I very much doubt it because the man found communication extremely difficult. So, and just to make 2 points, if I may. The first is that this is an example of someone who should never have been detained by the Home Office's own principles. This was someone who was clearly unwell. It didn't take anyone with any knowledge of mental health to see that this was someone presenting in such a way that he lacked capacity. So the fact that he was detained at all was just incomprehensible. And second, thing just to mention, and this relates to quite a few of these case studies. You'll see some of these other case studies, not case studies, snippets of case studies. It says something was disclosed to us, and then it looks as if we took no action. Mm-hmm. I look back at all of these. In nearly every case, the person was, had a conversation with us. We tried to follow up on it. The person was moved to the Verne, or people were moved around the detention estate, and this is a great problem for people becoming visible with their complaints. They're constantly being moved from pillar to post. As soon as they make a connection with someone, or someone starts advocating for them, the whole thing, happens again, and that's a really important thing to bear in mind when you're looking at the ability of people in a detention estate to make complaints.
And presumably people are moved between detention centres run by different companies as well, so we know that some were run by G4S, some were run by other companies as well, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And but given that the Home Office has a responsibility for all of these detention centres, did you consider raising a complaint to the Home Office about this allegation?
Which allegation?
The specific one about being hit on the left-hand side of his head.
So, I didn't, because I wasn't safeguarding lead.
Okay.
I don't know whether James considered it.
It may be useful in relation to some of these, that if you have further email evidence, that they can be disclosed in due course, so that we can consider them. Going to the next example, which is number 5. This relates to D687, who's also known as BB, and it says that he telephoned Gdwg from the Verne. He reported feeling sad and down. He said he tried to hang himself at Brookhouse. He said 6 or 7 officers had jumped on him and he was handcuffed. He had been taken to the Verne. I'm asked on behalf of G4S to ask why you describe this as physical mistreatment rather than just being a use of force.
Because that was how he described it to us.
Okay. While we're on this case, you talk about it a little bit in your statement elsewhere, but you say that he told you about, and when I say you, I of course again mean your organisation, about an incident of use of force at Brookhouse, but it was only after he'd moved to the Verne, I understand. For the record, those case records are at GDW 00006, page 17 to 22, but we don't need to bring them up on screen. Ms. Pincus, you say that because he was at the Verne at the time that he raised this allegation with you, that the organisation's approach was to refer him to the visitors group at the Verne, is that right?
Yes, that's generally the way it works. All the visitors groups collaborate very well with each other. We don't tread on each other's toes.
Given that the incident that he was disclosing referred to mistreatment at Brookhouse, did you consider that it might have been a matter for Gdwg to take forward rather than the Verne visitors group?
So we made sure that that the Verne visitors group were supporting him in relation to his emotional needs in processing that, what he had experienced as a trauma. And we made sure that they had, they told us actually, that they had referred him to public law solicitor to take up the issue. Okay.
And do you know whether any safeguarding referral was made by yourselves to G4S in this case, or would it not have been because he was at the Verne at the time?
It wouldn't have been because he was at the Verne at the time.
Okay. If we can go to example 6, please.
Mr. Livingston?
Yeah.
Sorry, but just while you pause, I wonder if I can just ask a quick point of clarification just while we're on the subject. Ms. Pincus, when you refer to Safer Community Team, is that what might sometimes be termed the Safer Custody Team? Is that a team within G4S?
Yes.
Okay, so that's not, just so that we're not confused, that's not any safeguarding mechanism in the community, such as the Adult Safeguarding Board. No. So it's within G4S and run G4S. Okay, thank you.
And actually, while we're talking about that, was there a specific contact that you had there? I think we've heard evidence that James Begg was one of the DCMs at the Safer Community Team. Do you know if that was who you would contact, or?
So, because I wasn't the safeguarding lead, I wasn't making those contacts.
Okay.
When I was looking through historic emails for the purpose of building this evidence inquiry, I saw James Begg's name.
Okay.
I think that would be a question for James.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. Yes, example 6. This is one of the ones in relation to mistreatment by escort staff. And you say in this example that the detained person called Gdwg 2 days after an attempt to transfer him and complained that escorts had hurt his wrist while he was after handcuffing him while he was being transferred. It's noted he was in great pain to his wrist and he was being taken to hospital. The wrist wasn't broken but was swollen. He had photos of the injuries and there was a recommendation that he should, and it says that G4S officers in Brookhouse recommended that he should report the incident, and it notes that he'd been held in segregation since the incident. Just a couple of questions about this. First of all, do you know whether this was reported by your organisation to anyone at the time?
No, it's not clear from that whether he reported it or whether we did.
Okay. And it obviously says here that G4S officers in Brookhouse recommended he should report the incident. To your understanding, is that because the escorts are obviously employed, the escorts are employed by a different company, which at that time was called Taskor?
Yes.
And so to your understanding, from what you understand, had G4S officers suggest that he make a complaint about the Taskor officers?
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay. And was any referral made in relation to this case that you know of?
I'm sorry, I don't remember the detail of the case.
Okay. The next example, please, example 7. Thank you. This says that Gdwg received a call from the detained person during the relevant period who said he'd been, and I'm summarising this, he'd been subject to the use of force during an attempt to transfer him. And going over to the next page, in summary, he says that he'd been tricked by officers who had initially told him that he just needed to speak to a manager about some documents, but then ended up being handed over to escorts for removal. He said he'd become very distressed, feeling he'd been tricked. He resisted removal, whereupon officers used force. He reported that they had assaulted him, causing him a head injury. He was being taken to hospital on account of the head injury, and he felt he was treated like an animal by Brookhouse officers. Do you know in relation to this case whether you reported it to anyone?
I'm sorry, I don't know what action we took as a result of that.
Okay. And would you, as a general rule, would you expect that in all of these cases that the person who's spoken to this person on the phone or met with this person to receive this information, would you expect that someone from Gdwg would at least ask them if they wanted to make a complaint about it?
Yes.
If we can look at example 8, please. This described as physical mistreatment by escort staff occurring within Brookhouse during the relevant period, and it says that Gdwg met with someone who said the officers were very rough with him when he was taken to the airport. Do you know if any report or referral was made in this case?
I think kind of applying a rule of proportionality to safeguarding, I don't think this would be an example of a case, because it would be almost inevitable that when someone's being moved against their will, they would experience treatment as very rough.
Okay. And we don't need to go to them individually because they refer to outside the relevant period, but you do give some examples in this table where people have told you, people who were detained during the relevant period have told you, your organisation, that they suffered mistreatment outside of the relevant period. Do you know in those cases whether there would be any referrals made?
Do you mean when we were interviewing people in 2020 and
Yeah.
they told us about things that happened historically?
Yeah, I framed that wrongly, yes. So, but you've correctly interpreted what I
Yeah.
wanted to ask. So,
Yeah.
in 2020, you've set out some of the things that because I think in 2020 you called some of the people that you'd been in touch with a few years previously in order to provide evidence to this inquiry. And some of them told you about things that had happened during the relevant period in 2017. What action would you have taken if someone, or did you take when people told you about that?
Well, we gave them emotional support throughout those conversations, but those people are all safe now. They've moved on in their own minds. I believe people interviewing them, I can't honestly be certain if they asked them if they wanted to make a historic complaint. That wasn't the purpose of the phone call.
To your knowledge, and you may not be able to help with this, was there any sort of limitation on how long ago you could make a complaint about it? So if a detained person called one of your staff members tomorrow and said, I'd like to make a complaint about something that happened to me in 2015 or 2017, to your knowledge, is there any limit on how far back those complaints can be made about?
Do you mean as a policy of the charity?
Well, as a policy of the charity, or to your knowledge, any policy of the Home Office or G4S or anything like that, would you still write to the Home Office potentially if someone asked you to about something that happened to them in 2015?
If someone requested that we did it, yes, of course we would.
Okay. And on reflection, I know that you have been able to look at some of the emails behind some of these things, and that on other occasions you just don't know because you weren't the safeguarding lead. But having looked at the examples you've given, do you consider on reflection that you should have, as an organisation, made more referrals to G4S or the Home Office or any other oversight body?
I think you have to understand that there were very, very many people complaining about very, very many things. We could have overwhelmed G4S and the Home Office with emails pointing out things that we thought weren't good practice. It would have used up a lot of our staff time and resources. It would have made them even more angry with us than they already were when we asked once if someone could be moved to another centre. James didn't have a positive relationship with them where it was easy for us to send every single item. We have a much better relationship now. Every time something is raised, I literally scattergun it. We write to the IMB, we write to Welfare, we write to Safer Custody, I write to Steve Hewer.
Is that someone who works for a circle?
He's
Steve
the
Hewer?
head of the centre.
Okay.
He hasn't told me not to write to him. So we have a different relationship with Serco now. But at that time, there was definitely a culture of silencing that was extremely effective upon GDWG.
Okay. And I want to ask you a bit about verbal mistreatment, which is another thing that you talk about in your statement and also in these examples. Now I understand, like with physical mistreatment, because you weren't in the wings, you wouldn't have witnessed this verbal mistreatment yourself. It would be things that you were told about. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And you give examples of some detained people that did report verbal abuse from staff. We can see here that there are examples over the page about detention officers telling detained people to go back to their own country, for example. Is that right?
Yes.
You or your organisation received complaints that staff had told detained people that?
Yes.
And you also give examples at paragraph 64 of your statement that you'd been told as an organisation that staff called detained people racist names such as monkey and blackie. Is that right?
It is.
Do you know if those examples were during the relevant period?
Yes, they were.
They were. And were you told which staff members had used this sort of language?
As I said, people weren't aware of the names of staff, or weren't always aware.
Where
How-
they, sorry,
Yeah.
where they were aware, because I appreciate you've said that often they wouldn't know, but if they did report a name, would that make you more likely to report it?
It's very difficult for us to report it when it's the word of a detained person against an officer, when it's an unsubstantiated complaint. And you've seen how normalised, you've seen from the footage how normalised racist language or unkind language was at that time. So many people expected that and didn't even probably tell us about it. But people would say things in generalised terms to us, like, you know, the officers are bad here, miss. And I'd say, oh, you know, do you want to tell me? No, I don't want you to know, miss. It's, you know, too bad to know, miss. Or they treat us like animals, miss. So people would tell us in general terms, would express their dehumanisation in general terms. And I think that's what the language was doing. It was dehumanising detained people.
And I understand that where it's told in general terms, I can see how it would be very difficult to make a complaint about that, because it would be almost impossible to investigate, presumably.
Mm-hmm.
But just coming back to the specifics, I know these are only examples, but the specifics of the allegation that the staff had called detained people monkey and blackie, did you consider reporting that allegation or those allegations to G4S?
Those allegations came to light when we were doing our interviews in 2020.
Okay.
And the detained person has moved on now, and he didn't wish us to make a historic complaint.
Okay.
But in any case, for someone to make a complaint, they have to believe that there's a reasonable chance that it will be upheld. Otherwise, it makes them lose even more faith in the system, and it makes them feel even more that they aren't heard. I think in 2019 there were 95 complaints, and one was upheld. So, in order to make a complaint, I don't think it would be responsible for it to be for the use of a racist word when it's one person's word against another's and there's no proof. I think it would be unsubstantiated.
So you yourself or your organisation wouldn't have had confidence that that would have been investigated properly or would have reached an outcome that would be satisfactory to the detained person. Is that fair?
If someone said someone called me a name, in the context of a detention centre where that was part of the culture and where the centre were not encouraging us to share our observations about the way people were treated, or any observations, I don't think we would have registered that as a complaint.
And I know that you received this, you were told this in 2020. It's obviously 3 years after Panorama and the relevant periods. So obviously by that time you'd watched Panorama presumably and seen some of the language being used. If you can try and transplant yourself back to the relevant period before Panorama, if you'd been told that type of language had been used, would you have been surprised?
I wouldn't have been surprised because I could see from the way staff reacted to detained persons that they were not treating them with the level of respect that I would have wished or expected.
And you say overall, when looking at verbal mistreatment, and you say this at paragraph 66 for the transcriber, that your impression was that many detention officers viewed detained people in a negative way and behaved towards them in a manner which ultimately dehumanised them or contributed to dehumanisation? Now, you've already talked a little bit about dehumanisation, but why did you come to that view? Was that based on what you've been told by people directly and by your colleagues?
So I guess it's two things really. So the first is that we were witnessing the impact of that treatment. So we were seeing how people were cowed, how they'd kind of be sweating with fear. We saw how people, lost weight and how people were generally made unwell by being in the centre and how they would describe their treatment. So there's what they said, how they looked, and then there are also the things that I personally witnessed, most of which are very, very tiny, especially in the context of what we saw in the footage for the inquiry, but things where even when people were behaving well to me, people would give themselves away by their actions. It might just be eye rolling.
And by people, you mean staff, presumably?
Staff,
Yeah.
yes, DCOs. Eye rolling when someone says something to them. Speaking very loudly in an exaggerated manner when someone doesn't understand English, and then if the person gives another response, laughing or speaking the same words again, even louder. Little things like people go through security to come to the visits corridor, someone might drop the contents of their pockets, all over the floor. Like, almost the instinctive thing to do is to, give them a hand. But, people would, stand over them. I said it's tone and bearing. It's really hard to put into words, but if you see it with your eyes, you know exactly what's going on. Comparing it to what we saw on the footage, it's small fry, it's nothing. We never could have imagined it could be on that scale. But it all indicates, those little things are indicators of the wider culture that led to the types of dehumanising that you saw when the man was howling on the ground.
And just to check on a small point of detail on that, you said it was DCOs, but I think you said earlier that most of your contact was with ACOs. Which, are you talking about both, or is it, when you're talking about these sort of actions, is it both or is it just DCOs?
It's very interesting, isn't it, that it was ACOs and DCOs. So the DCOs we'd see on the visits corridor when we were doing our drop-ins, but the ACOs, our visitors would come into contact with every day when they were coming to visit detained persons. And I think Jamie mentioned it, the ACOs would treat them, Gdwg visitors, mostly white, mostly middle class in one way, and then have a completely different tone and bearing to the families of detained persons who actually needed a lot more understanding and compassion because they were frequently maybe visiting someone for the final time, certainly visiting someone who they knew was going to be anxious, may not have understood the procedure, may have had a long journey. Some people travel down from Yorkshire to visit someone in Brookhouse. So many reasons why those people needed a lot more understanding than our visitors, but the behaviours were the other way around.
And one of the things that you said in your statement, I think when talking about this sort of dehumanisation or the general treatment, is that people reported that room searches were carried out in a manner which left them feeling bullied by staff, with personal items strewn around the cell. I've already asked you this in another context, but were you told which staff members had done this type of thing?
No, we weren't.
Okay. And do you know whether this type of conduct of sort of bullying style searches, do you know whether that was said to have happened during the relevant period?
Yes, I'm sure
Yes.
it was.
And would you have reported that type of thing?
No, we wouldn't.
Why not?
I think it just wouldn't cross the threshold of something we'd feel able to report to G4S. We might now, but at that time there was effective silencing, I think, of Gdwg. But James would answer to that better than me.
And I just wanted to check, actually, on the you talked about the dehumanising and some of the small-scale culture that existed. In your experience, and I know things have been strange because of COVID, and therefore visits are different, and there's different people, but is the situation different now?
I really hope it's not on the scale that it was. I think the fact that there's less spice in the centre, the fact that numbers have been much reduced in the centre due to COVID has changed the atmosphere. But members of staff still say to detained people, well, you chose to come here, go back to your own country. I think those types of utterances aren't rare.
One of the things that you refer to also when talking about this general type of mistreatment is that you say that you witnessed staff mishandling situations where detained people were distressed, having not been granted bail. Would that be that would be DCOs, or would that be DCOs?
Yes.
Okay. But you say that, and you say this at paragraph 67 of your statement, that you chose not to intervene in that situation, in the example you can remember, because it might have put your drop-in sessions at risk.
Yeah.
Although you chose not to intervene at the time, did you consider reporting it afterwards, or is this another situation that the threshold isn't crossed?
This was definitely not of a threshold where it would have been something to report. It just showed how ill-equipped staff were to respond to vulnerable people at a time of crisis. So the event that I referred to there was a man who'd just come out of a bail hearing, having been refused bail, and he'd kind of sunk to his knees in the corridor and was shouting that he didn't want to go, or raising his voice, saying he didn't want to go back, meaning go back into the main body of the centre. And it was a bit of a commotion, which was why I went to the doorway of the room. And once I looked out, I could see the man, and he was tearful, and it was almost as if he couldn't see the people around him. He was kind of in his own world of misery. And I had a kind of, like, I have a professional caring in my job, which I don't cross. But occasionally, you have a visceral sense of emotion. And in this case, my visceral sense of emotion was that my instinct was to would have been to have knelt down next to the man and looked him in the face and encouraged him, you can do this. But what the officers did was to raise their own voices louder than his, so that they were escalating a situation which was a man who wasn't trying to be non-compliant. He was just expressing in the moment his extreme distress. And he could have had a chance to bring himself out of that with some encouragement. Now, obviously, the officers aren't social workers. They're not necessarily trained in therapeutic support. Neither am I. But as a human being, there was a different response than the one that they gave. And the one that they gave ended up in a kind of scuffle of dragging him to his feet and him getting more upset and to be honest, him losing a bit of dignity, which he could have maintained if someone had talked to him. So I remember it because I was having to restrict my instinct and my visceral response, and that was uncomfortable.
And just so that we're clear about that, Ms. Pincus, because you said that your instinct was to potentially kneel down next to him and help him.
Yeah.
Why did you choose not to do that on that occasion?
Well, there were signs in the room that said, that people using the rooms as interview rooms are not allowed to leave the room unless taken by an officer. So that's like a rule. Occasionally, if I'd been in a drop-in room and someone had not come to see me, I might have suspected that they were waiting in the waiting room and that the staff hadn't had time or had forgotten to bring the person to me, and I'd leave the room to just say, "Hi, I'm still here waiting, is there someone for me?" Or and I'd get reprimanded for doing that. Plus, at the time, we were concerned that anything we did that angered G4S might threaten our drop-in.
So was that all going through your head?
That was all going through my mind, yeah.
Okay.
Now I've got to conform, I've got to do what G4S wishes of me, and I repress that instinct to just take my head down to the same level as the man and encourage him. And it was very uncomfortable. In retrospect, I probably wished I had.
And looking back, we've talked a bit about the approach that Gdwg took in terms of raising complaints and when you felt like you could, and you talked about the culture of silencing. Did you, at the time, agree with the approach that James Wilson, the director of Gdwg at the time, was taking to when you should report complaints and things like that?
I did, because we're a welfare group. We exist for the welfare, to support people. If our drop-in had been taken away from us, that would have become much more difficult. We would have been able to help only a small proportion of people that we were able to help with the drop-in. People who were extremely vulnerable, who found it hard to communicate on the phone, or who had very poor English, found it hard to communicate on the phone, we wouldn't have been able to help to the same extent. So it was crucial that we did everything we could to maintain our drop-ins.
I want to come on to a new topic, which is about your, as an organisation, awareness of what was reported on Panorama. Broadly, to summarise, and you can tell me if this is wrong, I think your evidence is that you as an organisation knew that some detained people had complaints about treatment and weren't treated well, but that you only realised the gravity of the situation upon watching Panorama. Is that right?
It is.
And I know you've set out some reasons for this at paragraph 76 onwards of your statement, but if you can sort of summarise for us, why do you think that you as an organisation didn't realise the gravity of the situation at the time?
Well, I think the most, it sounds an obvious reason, but it is the most, it is the main factor, is that we simply weren't permitted beyond that door in the visits corridor. So we never saw how people were treated on the wings.
That obviously applies to seeing things yourselves, but I suppose there's obviously the other issue of why you think that you didn't realise the gravity of the situation from all of the people that you were seeing, both the staff and the visitors, of what was going on at the time.
I think it's important to realise that that detained people are experiencing many levels of harm. So the architecture of the centre itself is experienced as a harm. It's a very brutal place to be. The fact that people are detained indefinitely causes harm and mental health distress. So for people in detention, they would express their their feelings about the situation, but it would be about many of the different harms. The fact that they were detained at all, the fact that they had no idea what was happening with their case, their sense of bewilderment, the fact that there was no privacy.
And so, are you
So this was another kind of manifestation of an injustice that they felt, but it was one of many, and they were bringing them all to us.
And so sometimes these type of complaints might have got lost or just immersed within complaints about access to healthcare, complaints about the conditions, complaints about the food, all sort of coming together. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And to the extent that you've been able to do this, when reflecting on this period, do you think that there's anything as an organisation that you could have done in order to have a better understanding of what was going on at the time?
With the amount of access that we had, I don't think there is. We knew what was happening on one level. You know, we knew that people said they were treated like animals. We knew whispers of occasional events of mistreatment. We had no idea of the scale. Like things that we saw on the footage, just beyond the scale of, you know, what is shocking or what is acceptable. We never could have imagined it.
And I know you've said, and I've asked you about this a few times, about the names of staff members responsible for this stuff, and you said that often they wouldn't know, so you wouldn't get told. Were there any names that were that came up in Panorama, or that have come up since that it sort of occurred to you, oh yeah, we heard quite a lot of things about that person?
No, people would never name a person.
Okay. One of the things you say at paragraph 73 of your statement, Ms. Pincus, is that one of the detained people who appeared in Panorama reported to Gdwg something of the incident he was involved in, but that you don't have his authority to provide the details. So without going into those details, are you able to tell us what steps Gdwg did take in response to that?
I'm sorry, without notes of that, I could report that to the inquiry afterwards,
That would be
having
helpful.
checked our database.
That would be helpful, thank you. One of the things that you've said in your statement that you think might improve your ability to identify mistreatment as an organisation is, I think, by holding your drop-in sessions in the library, so in the main bit of the centre. Is that right?
Yes.
And why is that, if it doesn't seem too obvious?
I think we'd be able to see for ourselves how people are moving around, how they're interacting with staff, and we'd be able to meet with a greater range of people, not just people who are, as I said before, well enough to self-refer through a telephone call.
And has the idea of you holding drop-ins in the library, to your knowledge, ever been raised, either with G4S at the time or with Serco more recently?
I have mentioned it to Serco since they took over the contract.
Where have you got with that?
I think they're considering it.
Okay. Are there any reasons given for not doing it? Is it about security, or do you not know the reasons?
I don't think there were any reasons. There wasn't a negative response.
Okay. Thank you. Chair, I have about another half an hour to 45 minutes for this witness. I wonder, just to avoid us sort of having just a short period after, whether it's a good idea to break for lunch now a bit early and then come back at say 1:45, if that's possible.
That sounds like a good idea. Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Pincus, and we'll return at 1:45. Thank you, Mr. Livingston.